The air inside the rehearsal hall felt thick, almost heavy enough to touch. It wasn't hot outside, but the large windows lining the room seemed to trap the nervous energy of 24 young musicians. The smell of floor wax mixed with the faint scent of old sheet music created a unique atmosphere that only music students truly knew. Sunlight cut across the polished floorboards in bright, sharp lines, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stillness. Usually, this place was a sanctuary of sound, a place where time was measured in measures and beats. Today, however, it felt like a waiting room for a trial. Near the far corner, where the shadows were longest, sat the grand piano. It was a beast of an instrument, black and gleaming, demanding attention from anyone who walked by. Perched on the padded bench was a young woman. Let's call her Sophie. She wasn't looking at the other students tuning their violins or warming up their vocal cords. Her eyes were fixed intently on the keys in front of her, but her mind was miles away. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers unconsciously opening and closing, as if she were trying to grab onto something that wasn't there. On the music rack sat a thick, intimidating book of classical pieces. It was open to a page covered in dense black notes arpeggios, trills, and key signatures that looked like a complex mathematical equation. This was the piece she was supposed to play. It was a showstopper, a technical masterpiece designed to prove to the world that she had talent. Her teacher had picked it out months ago, beaming with pride. "This is the one," the teacher had said. "This will make them remember you." But Sophie didn't feel like remembering it. Today, her fingers felt like sausages. When she tried to imagine the first run of notes, her mind went blank. It was as if the neural pathways in her brain had been severed overnight. She had played this piece perfectly in her living room 1,000 times. But now, under the harsh lights of the rehearsal hall, the music had abandoned her. "You look terrified," a voice cut through her thoughts. Sophie flinched and looked up. Standing a few feet away was a boy holding a cello case. He wasn't being mean. He was just stating a fact. He looked tired, his hair messy from running his hands through it. "I'm fine," Sophie lied, her voice sounding small in the large room. "You don't look fine," he said, shifting the weight of his instrument. "Is that the list?" "That thing is a monster. I heard the judges hate it when people mess up the tempo in the middle section." Sophie swallowed hard. She hadn't even thought about the tempo until he mentioned it. Now, the thought of stumbling through the fast part made her stomach churn. She looked back at the keys, the ivory looking yellowed in the sunlight. "Hey, listen," the boy continued, sensing her panic. "If you're not ready, maybe just, scale it back. Play the Mozart sonata or something. Just play something easy. It's better to play a simple piece well than to crash and burn on a hard one. Play something easy." The words echoed in Sophie's head. They weren't new. She had heard them before. Just then, the double doors at the back of the hall swung open. It wasn't a loud bang, but the sudden change in air pressure made everyone turn their heads. A woman walked in with a brisk, purposeful stride. It was Sophie's mother. She was wearing a smart blazer and held a clipboard under one arm, looking every bit the organizer she was. She scanned the room, her eyes locking onto Sophie near the piano. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. The noise was like a metronome counting down a deadline. "How's it going?" her mother asked, not wasting time on a greeting. "I spoke to the adjudicator. They are running ahead of schedule. You might be up sooner than we thought." Sophie felt her throat go dry. "Mom, I don't know if I can do the big piece today. My hands are stiff." Her mother stopped clicking her pen. She looked down at the sheet music, then back at Sophie's face. Her expression wasn't angry, but it was tired. It was the look of someone who had sacrificed a lot of time and money for these lessons. "You've practiced it for 6 months, Sophie," she said, her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "We paid for that extra coaching. You can't just decide to change it now because you're nervous." "But I keep messing up the transitions," Sophie whispered, pleading. "It feels wooden. It feels like I'm just typing out numbers." "Then focus harder," her mother snapped, though she quickly softened her tone, rubbing her temples. "Look, just get through it. Hit the right notes. Don't try to add anything fancy. If you can't do the expression, just play the notes. But for heaven's sake, don't embarrass yourself by playing a nursery rhyme. A few students nearby glanced over. They hadn't heard the words, but they saw the interaction. Sophie felt her face get hot. She hated being looked at like this. She hated being the investment that had to pay off. Her mother checked her watch. I have to go check the seating chart. Just warm up. And please, try to look like you want to be here. With that, her mother turned and walked away, stopping briefly to talk to the event coordinator by the entrance. Sophie was left alone on the bench again. The air in the room felt even thicker than before. She looked at the list piece. The notes seemed to be mocking her, little black insects crawling up the staff. She placed her hands on the keys. She took a deep breath and tried to play the first measure. Her finger slipped. The sound was jarring, a wrong note that rang out clearly in the quiet hall. Someone nearby giggled. It wasn't a cruel laugh, just a nervous reaction to a mistake. But it felt like a slap to Sophie. She yanked her hands back. This wasn't working. Her grandfather used to tell her that music was a language you spoke with your heart, not your hands. But she hadn't played with her heart in a long time. She had been playing to please judges, to please her mother, to prove she was good. She reached into her bag sitting on the floor beside the bench. Her fingers brushed against the smooth cardboard of a different booklet. It was thin, old, and dog-eared. It wasn't a book of concertos. It was a book of traditional folk songs and lullabies she had bought at a used bookstore years ago. She pulled it out. The cover was faded blue. She opened it to a random page. The notes were sparse. There were no runs, no trills, no terrifying jumps across the keyboard. Just a simple melody. The water is wide, the title read. It was a song her grandfather used to hum while he worked in his garden. Sophie looked up at the clock. She had 10 minutes before she was supposed to be on stage. The rational part of her brain screamed at her. Asterisk, are you crazy? You can't play this. It's too simple. They will laugh you off the stage. Your mother will kill you. Asterisk, but the other part of her brain, the tired, grieving part that missed her grandfather, just wanted to hear something beautiful. Something that wasn't a test. She looked at the intimidating black book of concertos. She slowly closed it. The heavy thud of the book closing felt like a cage door shutting. Then she opened the thin blue booklet and propped it up on the music rack. Okay, she whispered to the empty room. Let's try this. She placed her hands back on the keys. They didn't feel like sausages anymore. They felt like hands. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and pressed down the first chord. It wasn't a sound of panic. It was a sound of peace. And for the first time all day, the sunlight coming through the window didn't feel harsh. It just felt like light. The pathway from the rehearsal hall to the backstage area was narrow and dimly lit. It smelled of dust, old velvet, and that distinct metallic scent of anxiety that hangs in the air behind any curtain. Sophie walked slowly, clutching the thin, faded blue booklet against her chest as if it were a shield. The noise of the rehearsal hall, the tuning instruments, the loud voices, the judgmental glares faded away, replaced by a heavy, muffled silence. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making your own breathing sound like a roar. Backstage was a chaotic maze of equipment cases, loose cables snaking across the floor like black vines, and folding chairs that had seen better decades. Sophie found an empty spot near a rack of coats and sat down. The plastic chair was cold and uncomfortable, grounding her in the reality of the moment. Around her, other performers were in their own worlds. A girl with a violin was frantically rubbing rosin on her bow, her movements jagged and aggressive. A boy was doing weird breathing exercises, puffing out his cheeks and exhaling loudly. They were all preparing for a battle, getting ready to fight for points and approval. Sophie looked down at the booklet in her hands. Her fingers traced the cracked spine. This was not the weapon of a warrior. This was a memory. It had been exactly 1 year since her grandfather passed away. It felt strange to think that time moved in a straight line, marching forward second by second, while her heart felt like it was still stuck in that hospital waiting room, listening to the hum of the vending machine. Her grandfather was the one who had actually taught her how to touch the piano keys. He wasn't a fancy teacher with a degree from a conservatory. He was just a man who loved sound. She closed her eyes and could almost see his workshop. It was a cluttered little shed behind his house, smelling of sawdust and oil. He used to sit on an old stool, wiping grease from his hands with a rag and hum. He didn't hum complicated operas. He hummed folk songs. Street songs. The kind of songs that regular people sang while they worked. "You're rushing, Sophie," he would say gently whenever she played a scale too fast. "Why are you in such a hurry? The note wants to be heard. Let it stay a while. Invite it in for tea." She remembered giggling at that. "It's just a note, Grandpa." "Do," he would say, tapping his chest right over his heart. "It's a feeling. If you play it and you don't feel it, you're just making noise. And the world has enough noise already." Since he had died, the piano had changed. It stopped being a friend and became a taskmaster. Every time she sat down to practice the difficult concertos, she felt like she was typing data into a computer. C#, G major, diminished seventh. It was all math. It was all logic. And she was tired of logic. Logic didn't make you cry. Logic didn't make you hug someone. Logic didn't make you remember the smell of sawdust. She opened the blue booklet to the page she had chosen. "The water is wide." The melody was ancient. It was a song about loss, about how the things that love us often drift away beyond our reach. It was technically simple. A first-year student could play the notes, but the notes weren't the point. The space between the notes was the point. Sophie looked around the crowded backstage area. She saw a girl who looked like she was about to throw up. She saw a boy whose hands were shaking so badly he couldn't tie his necktie. Everyone was terrified of making a mistake. They were terrified of hitting a wrong note, of slipping on a pedal, of forgetting a measure. And then she realized what she was terrified of. It wasn't hitting the wrong key. It was being invisible. If she played the difficult Liszt piece and messed up, she would be a failure. If she played it perfectly, she would just be good. She would be another kid in a long line of kids who played fast and loud. But if she played this simple, sad song, she would be showing them who she actually was. She would be stripping away the armor of technical skill and standing there in her grief. That was much scarier than playing fast. "Number 14, you're on," a stagehand with a headset whispered, poking his head around a corner. The girl with the violin stood up, wiping her hands on her dress. She walked toward the light, leaving her sheet music on the chair. Sophie watched her go. She didn't look back. Sophie took a deep breath. She could feel her heart beating against her ribs, a fast rhythmic thump. She wasn't thinking about the mechanics of the music. She wasn't thinking about finger position or wrist flexion. She was thinking about her grandfather's garden. She was thinking about the way the sun used to hit his face when he laughed. She was thinking about how much she missed him. She touched the pages of the booklet one last time. The paper was soft, almost like fabric. This wasn't a backup plan. She realized that now. This was the only thing she could play that was true. The complicated music was a lie she had been telling herself to fit in. The simple music was the truth. The sound of applause drifted from the stage, the polite, obligatory clapping for the violinist. Then the muffled voice of the announcer introducing the next act. Sophie stood up. Her legs felt a little unsteady, like she was standing on a boat that was rocking gently. But her hands were steady. She smoothed down the front of her skirt. She looked at the other kids backstage, their eyes wide with panic. They were playing a game. She was doing something else. She thought about what her mother had said. "Don't embarrass yourself." Her mother didn't understand. Embarrassment comes from trying to be something you're not and failing. Sophie wasn't trying to be a virtuoso right now. She was just trying to be a granddaughter who missed her grandfather. A woman with a clipboard walked by looking at a list. "Okay, Sophie, you're next. Get ready." Sophie nodded. She didn't say anything. She just picked up her little blue book. It looked so small in her hand compared to the heavy binders everyone else was carrying. It looked insignificant. She walked toward the heavy blackout curtains that separated the backstage shadows from the bright stage lights. She could feel the heat radiating from the spotlights, even from back here. The hum of the auditorium, that specific sound of a large room, is full of people trying to be quiet, grew louder. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was a conversation, and she was the only one who knew what she was about to say. She took one last breath of the dusty backstage air, closed her eyes for a split second to see his face, and then stepped forward, moving from the safety of the shadows into the blinding light. The walk from the shadows of the wings to the center of the stage felt longer than any distance Sophie had ever traveled. It was only about 20 steps, but with every movement of her flats against the floor, the weight of the audience settled on her shoulders. The air changed instantly. Backstage was cool and smelled of dust and anxiety. But out here, under the bright lights, the air was stale and smelled of perfume, cologne, and too many people packed into a room. The temperature felt 10 degrees hotter, the spotlights bearing down on her like a physical weight. Sophie walked to the large grand piano, standing alone in the center of the polished floor. It gleamed like a black mirror, reflecting the lights and the silhouette of the crowd. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes locking onto her. They weren't looking at her with malice, but with curiosity and a hint of boredom. They were waiting to be entertained, waiting to see if this nervous young woman would crash and burn, or impress them with technical skill as she reached the bench. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the high ceilings. "Next, we have Sophie," the woman said, her voice loud and clipped. "Sophie has prepared a selection from the advanced classical repertoire. Please welcome her to the stage." There was a ripple of polite applause. It was the kind of applause that sounds like rain hitting a tin roof, steady, rhythmic, and utterly impersonal. People clapped because it was polite, not because they were excited. Sophie saw a few people in the front row glancing at their programs, then back at her, eyebrows raising slightly as if to say, "Let's see what you can do." Sophie sat down on the bench. It was firm and adjusted to a height that felt just a little too low. She reached for the knob to raise the seat, the mechanical click cutting through the silence. A few heads turned. She felt clumsy. This was the moment when the serious musicians sat down, adjusted their jacket tails, and immediately put their hands on the keys to prove they were ready. But Sophie didn't put her hands on the keys yet. She looked out into the sea of faces. It was dizzying. In the second row, she saw her mother. She was sitting on the edge of her chair, her back perfectly straight, clutching her purse with white knuckles. Her mother's eyes were wide, darting from Sophie to the judge's table in the corner. She looked terrified, as if her own life depended on the next 5 minutes. Next to her, Sophie's father sat with his arms crossed, trying to look supportive but looking stiff instead. Sophie's gaze drifted past them to the judges. 3 people sat behind a long table with water bottles and stacks of paper. They were already holding their pens, ready to circle numbers, ready to critique posture and tempo and dynamics. They looked like scientists waiting to observe an experiment. Then she looked at the music rack. Usually this is where she would prop up the massive, heavy book of concertos. The book that shouted, "I am important. I am difficult." But today, the rack was empty. In her lap, she held the small, faded blue booklet. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a child's toy compared to the imposing instrument in front of her. She could feel a shift in the atmosphere. The silence was changing from expectant to confused. People were whispering. Asterisk, where is her music? Asterisk, is she playing from memory? Asterisk, Sophie didn't open the booklet yet. She placed it gently on the music rack. It was so thin that it barely leaned against the stand. It looked lost against the vast black gloss of the piano. From the corner of her eye, she saw her mother lean forward slightly, her brow furrowing. She couldn't see the title from that distance, but she could tell it wasn't the thick book of Chopin or Liszt. She saw her mother whisper something urgently to her father, probably asking where the other music was. The announcer had said advanced classical repertoire. That was what everyone was expecting. They were expecting thunder. They were expecting fast fingers flying up and down the keyboard. They were expecting a battle. Sophie took a deep breath. She could feel her heart beating against her ribs, but it wasn't the panicky, fluttering beat from earlier. It was a slow, heavy thud, like a drum in a deep cave. She thought about her grandfather. He used to tell her that silence was a note too. that the space before you played was just as important as the sound itself. She looked at the keys. They were white and clean, untouched. She reached out her hands. Her fingers were pale against the black background of the piano body. She didn't arch them into the rigid, claw-like shape her teacher had drilled into her. She let them hang naturally, loose and soft. A man in the fifth row coughed. The sound was harsh and loud, breaking the tension. A few people shifted in their seats, the plastic chairs creaking. The weight was becoming uncomfortable. The audience was getting restless. They wanted the show to start. Sophie closed her eyes for just a second. She blocked out the lights, the dust motes, the judges with their pens, and her mother's terrified face. She saw the garden. She heard the humming. She felt the peace of that memory. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at the simple, black and white notes on the yellowed paper of the booklet. It was "The Water is Wide," a song of sadness, a song of letting go. She placed her left hand on the low keys, finding the deep. Resonant C, she placed her right hand higher up, ready to begin. There was no grand gesture. No deep breath to signal the start. She just pressed down. A single soft chord filled the hall. It wasn't a crash. It was a whisper. It was a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of the piano, drifting upward like smoke. The people in the back row leaned forward, straining to hear. The coughing stopped instantly. The whispering died. This wasn't what they had come for. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession. And the whole room went quiet, waiting to see what she would say next. The first chord hung in the air like a delicate mist, refusing to fade away. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the piano strings, but in the chest of every person sitting in the room. Usually, at this point in a recital, the pianist would launch into a flurry of fast notes to grab the audience's attention. But Sophie did nothing. She let the silence stretch, holding her hands hovering just above the keys, letting the sound decay naturally until it was just a memory in the air. Then her right hand moved. It wasn't a rapid, sharp attack. It was a slow, deliberate press. The melody began to emerge. It was "The Water is Wide," a folk tune so ancient and simple that almost everyone in the audience knew it, though none of them expected to hear it here. It was the kind of song you hummed while washing dishes, not the kind of song you played on a stage in front of judges. For the first 10 seconds, a wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. A man in the fifth row shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly thinking she was playing a warm-up exercise. In the front row, Sophie's mother stopped breathing. She gripped her father's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. She wasn't hearing the complex, flashy arpeggios they had paid for. She was hearing a nursery rhyme. The humiliation she had feared wasn't just knocking on the door. It had walked right in and sat down at the piano. But then, something changed. Sophie began to play not just the notes on the page, but the spaces between them. She wasn't treating the song as a simple melody. She was stretching it, pulling it apart like taffy. She added a dissonance hera note that clashed ever so slightly with the harmony, creating a tension that felt like a physical ache in the stomach. It sounded like a memory that was happy, but also incredibly sad. The technique wasn't flashy. There were no scales racing up and down the keyboard, but the control she had over the tone was terrifyingly precise. She could make the piano sound like it was weeping, and then, in the next phrase, make it sound like it was comforting you. The audience stopped shifting. The whispering died out completely. The man who had been bored earlier found himself leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the young woman's back. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. It wasn't because she was playing difficult music. It was because she was playing with a rawness that was rare to see. She wasn't performing. She was unraveling. Sophie's eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side. She wasn't thinking about the music theory. She wasn't thinking about her posture. She was playing the sound of her grandfather's voice. She was playing the feeling of the empty chair in his kitchen. She was playing the frustration of trying to be perfect for people who didn't know her. As the song moved toward the bridge, the intensity grew. She wasn't playing louder, but the harmonies became thicker, more complex. The bass notes in her left hand became deeper, grounding the soaring melody of her right hand. It sounded like the ocean calm on the surface, but with a terrifying, powerful current underneath. And then it happened. Her finger slipped. It was a small mistake. A split-second fumble on a transition. The wrong key sounded a sharp, jarring note that stuck out like a jagged rock in a smooth stream. In a normal competition, this was the moment of disaster. This was where the judges would circle a red mark and lower the score. This was where the audience would wince in sympathy. Sophie's mother put a hand over her mouth, her eyes squeezing shut. She knew this was it. The mistake would break the spell. The illusion would shatter. But Sophie didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct the note instantly. She did something else. She leaned into the mistake. She struck the same wrong note again, harder this time, turning it into a deliberate statement of pain. Then she resolved it slowly, sliding her finger to the correct key with a sigh-like quality that broke everyone's heart. The mistake wasn't an error anymore. It was the most honest part of the song. It sounded like a sob. It sounded like a stutter in your voice when you try to talk about something that hurts too much. The audience didn't wince. They felt it. They felt it in their own throats. A young woman in the third row, who had been checking her phone moments ago, suddenly put the phone down. She stared at the stage, her eyes unexpectedly filling with tears. She didn't know Sophie, and she didn't know the story about the grandfather, but she recognized the sound of grief. She knew what it sounded like to try to be strong and then crack just a little bit. The music swelled again, this time with a new layer of meaning. It wasn't just a folk song anymore. It was a conversation with the past. Sophie was playing as if she was trying to reach across a great distance, trying to touch someone one last time. The dynamics shifted, soft as a whisper, then roaring like a wave, then soft again. The judges, who had been readying their pens to critique technical precision, slowly lowered their hands. They weren't judging anymore. They were witnessing. The oldest judge, a man who had listened to thousands of students play over 50 years, removed his glasses. He looked at the girl with the slumped shoulders and the closed eyes, and he saw a transparency that he almost never saw. She was hiding nothing. Sophie was nearing the end of the piece. The melody was slowing down, the notes becoming further apart, like the heartbeat of someone falling asleep. She wasn't rushing to the finish line. She was savoring every sound, dragging out the farewell. In the front row, Sophie's mother had let go of her husband's arm. Her face was wet with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She wasn't thinking about the money spent on lessons anymore. She wasn't thinking about the reputation or the neighbors. She was just seeing her daughter, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time in years. She saw the pain Sophie had been carrying, the pressure she had been under, and the beautiful way she was letting it out. The final chord was approaching. Sophie raised her hands high, her silhouette framed against the bright backdrop of the stage. She brought them down not with a bang, but with a gentle, weighted pressure that seemed to push all the air out of the room. She played the root note, the fifth, and the melody note all together, creating a sound that was full, rich, and final. She held the chord. Her foot pressed the sustain pedal down, holding the vibration in the strings. She didn't lift her hands. She sat there, head bowed, letting the sound resonate and ring, filling the auditorium with a golden glow that seemed to suspend time. There were no clicks of pens, no rustling of programs, no coughing. There was only the sound of the piano singing its final heartbreaking breath, echoing off the walls and ceiling, refusing to disappear. The sound of the final chord seemed to hang in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, refusing to disappear. Sophie kept her hands pressed lightly on the keys, feeling the vibration of the strings dying away beneath her fingertips. She kept her head bowed, her eyes closed, not because she was afraid to look up, but because she wasn't ready to let go of the moment yet. She was still in the garden with her grandfather. She was still holding on to that memory. In the auditorium, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, thick silence that felt physically different from the quiet that usually follows a performance. Usually after a student plays, there is a split second of pause. It's followed by the rustling of programs, a cough, or the whispered good job from a parent. But there was none of that now. It was as if the 300 people in the room had collectively stopped breathing. They were paralyzed, stunned by a sound that was so raw and so honest that it didn't require a response. It just required witnessing. Sophie slowly lifted her hands from the keys. The movement broke the spell for her, and she took a deep, shaky breath, blinking her eyes open. The bright stage lights made her vision blur for a second, white spots dancing in her field of view. She sat up straighter and turned slightly on the bench to face the audience. As she looked out, she expected to see boredom. She expected to see confusion. She expected to see people checking their watches, wondering why she had played such a simple, sad song instead of the flashy piece they were promised. Instead, she saw a sea of still faces. In the front row, her mother was sitting completely still, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face that she made no attempt to wipe away. Her father wasn't looking at the program. He was looking at his daughter with an expression of pure awe, as if he were seeing a stranger he had lived with for years but never truly known. 10 seconds passed. 15 seconds. Then, in the back row, an elderly man slowly stood up. He didn't clap immediately. He just stood there, looking at the young woman on stage with a look of deep respect. He had come to hear a competition, but he had been given a gift. He began to clap. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping of obligation. It was a slow, steady clap of appreciation. Suddenly, the dam broke. A woman in the third row stood up, then a young man near the aisle. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause didn't just start, it erupted. It was a thunderous, roaring sound that bounced off the high ceiling and shook the floorboards. It wasn't just clapping anymore. People were cheering. Someone shouted, "Bravo." It was a chaotic, messy, loud expression of humanity. They weren't clapping because she had played the notes perfectly. They were clapping because she had made them feel something. She had reached past their ears and grabbed their hearts. Sophie felt a wave of shock wash over her. She stood up, her legs feeling weak. She offered a small, shy bow. It wasn't the practiced, theatrical bow she had been taught in etiquette class. It was a quick nod, a gesture of gratitude to them for listening. She didn't smile a big fake smile. She just looked at them with her honest, vulnerable face. And the crowd seemed to love her even more for it. She turned and walked off the stage, the applause chasing her every step. As she stepped into the cool shadows of the wings, the roar of the crowd was cut off instantly by the heavy curtains. Leaving her ears ringing, the stagehand with the headset was standing there, his mouth slightly open. He looked at her differently now. He wasn't looking at a nervous kid anymore. "That was incredible," he stammered, almost forgetting to usher her along. "You really got them." Sophie walked back to the narrow hallway where the other students were gathering. Usually this was a place of smug satisfaction or bitter tears. Today the atmosphere was strange. The girl with the violin, who had been frantically rosin her bow, earlier looked at Sophie with wide eyes. "I heard it from here," she whispered. "It sounded, I don't know, real." Sophie didn't know what to say. She just clutched her thin blue booklet to her chest and kept walking. She felt lighter than she had in a year. The heavy weight of expectation, the need to be perfect, the need to please the judges, it had all vanished. She hadn't won the competition in the traditional sense. She had played a piece with no technical difficulty, but somehow she knew she had won something much more important. She had told the truth, and the world had actually stopped to listen. When she finally made it out to the lobby, her mother and father were waiting. They didn't rush her with questions about the judges or the score sheet. Her mother just pulled her into a hug, holding her so tight that Sophie could barely breathe. "I'm so sorry," her mother whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I told you to play something easy. That wasn't easy. That was the hardest thing I've ever heard. It was just a song, Mom," Sophie whispered back, closing her eyes. "It wasn't just a song," her father said, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It was you." They walked out of the building together. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot. The air was cool and fresh. Sophie looked up at the sky, watching the first few stars appear. She thought about her grandfather. She wondered if he had heard it. She decided that he had. She got into the back seat of the car, the blue booklet resting safely on her lap. She didn't open it. She didn't need to look at the notes anymore. The music wasn't on the paper. The music was in her, and for the first time, in a long time, she knew it would always be there whenever she needed it. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and watched the world go by, humming softly, a smile finally touching her lips.